We have been introduced to all the major pieces in the story of Esther, all the pieces by way of persons that are found in the book that make a contribution to the ongoing development of the narrative. Today we continue our series called The Queen's Gambit. The story has been set up between a Persian king and his wife, and it is founded upon a 180-day event. So a king by the name of Ahasuerus calls together all the governors of his provinces for over 180 days for a series of international meetings so that he can prepare for another advance upon Greece. And so we're told at the end of that 180 days, and all the governors, 120 of them in all, there is a time where the king decides to show off his wife, and her name is Vashti. There is a total of 3 feasts in the first chapter of Esther, and that includes one for these leaders. There's a second one for the servants that help bring about all these international meetings. And then, thirdly, there's one for the women. And this one, Vashti, is the hostess. And what we find is King Ahasuerus wants to promote loyalty and unity for his cause, so he provides plenty of drinks and plenty of entertainment. So toward the end of this time, when the king is drunk and he is not in his right mind, he decides that he is going to show off Queen Vashti. He's going to show off her beauty because she is the symbol of Miss Persia. The refusal, though, of Vashti to come at the king's command is a big deal in that culture, and it is ultimately inexcusable. And for the queen not to come at the request of the king is a cause for disciplinary action. So some of these leaders gather around the king, and they make a point that she needs to be deposed. She could be the potential danger of other wives not listening to their husbands. So the solution is to get rid of Queen Vashti and to replace her with another queen. So this solution is ultimately to keep the system in place so that whenever a man issues a royal command, the wives are willingly obeying. Now, Esther enters into the story as a Jewish orphan. She has lost her family, but she has been raised by her cousin Mordecai. And what we find taking place is that in this story, Esther goes through a series of beauty treatments, and at the end of that time, we find that she goes in and she begins a time to get to know King Ahasuerus, and ultimately she wins the heart of King Ahasuerus, and she becomes the new queen. In the meantime, what we find is that Mordecai, who is an important representative in the royal court, hears of a plot to murder the king. And what we find is, as this plot has been revealed to the king, these 2 men that decided to revolt against the king are hung. So now we have 3 pieces that have been removed from the chessboard that we are using as an illustration for this book. Now, Esther is elevated to this position of being a queen, and what we find is that as the queen, she has the opportunity to bring influence upon the king. We also learned last week, and I appreciate Corey filling in for me last Sunday, that Mordecai, who uncovered the plot to murder the king, was never honored. And so this has been set aside. He finds himself back in the place that he was before, but there comes another individual by the name of Haman. Haman becomes second in command to the king, and what we find taking place is that he asks the king to issue a command that all people would bow down to him as he passed by. And so this man, full of conceit and arrogance, he is an individual that wants everyone to look up to him and to obey him. But there is one person that refuses to do so, and Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. Now that sets up the next sequence, and what we find taking place is Haman is an individual that not only hates the actions of Mordecai, but also hates the ethnicity of Mordecai as well. Mordecai is a Jew. And it is believed that if Haman simply destroys Mordecai alone, that would not prevent other people from mimicking his actions and doing the same toward Haman. So it's all about Haman. It's all about his pride. It's all about his hatred of this people group. And what we find taking place is Haman goes before the king and asks the king to issue a command to kill all the Jews in the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So Haman decides to cast a lot. And this book, the book of Esther, is part of a celebration of what is called Purim. And Pur in Hebrew means the casting of lots. And so they cast the lots and they determine a particular day upon which all the Jews are going to be exterminated. Haman tells the king that if he will follow through on this command, that he will fill the king's treasuries with 10,000 talents of silver, and he will get it from the spoils of war upon the Jews. So that brings us up to date on all the pieces and the plots so far in the book of Esther. Today we turn to chapter 4. In chapter 4, what we find taking place is that now Mordecai will come before Queen Esther and tell her about this decree to exterminate the Jewish people. Now, how quickly things can turn in a moment's notice. What we find is that in our own personal lives, it's as quick as a phone call that can change the scenario of everything. And Mordecai, when he hears this decree to exterminate the Jews, he goes into mourning. And what we find in verses 1 through 3 is that Mordecai learned all that was going to be done, and he tears his clothes, and he puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he goes out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Now, Mordecai, in rendering his clothes and putting on sackcloth and ashes, is doing something that is quite common in the ancient Near East. It's an expression of extreme sorrow. Sackcloth is likened to grave clothes, and ashes are associated with death, as in ashes to ashes and dust to dust. So Mordecai went from sackcloth and ashes to this public display of mourning, and it catches the attention of Queen Esther. And what we find is she then sends word and asks about why there is this large expression of grief that is circulating among the empire. Well, to express mourning in the presence of the king is extremely forbidden. And so now Mordecai and Esther are going to communicate to each other, but not face to face. And what we're told is that he will explain what is taking place through an intermediary by the name of Hattach, and he is found in verse 6. So Hattach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for the annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain to her, and he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Now we have the setup. Esther, it seems, was unaware of the decree of King Ahasuerus, and so this message that comes to Esther will cause her to go into mourning as well. But Mordecai sends a charge to Esther to go into the king's presence and plead on behalf of the Jewish people. Now, Esther, though, realizes this is very dangerous because no one goes into the king's presence without an invitation, including his own wife. And the question becomes, how is Esther going to respond? Having received the command from Mordecai to intercede on behalf of her people, what we find is that Esther responds and tells us down in verse 11 that she hasn't even seen the king himself for the last 30 days. Interesting. So here is the king and the queen that haven't seen each other for over a month. And so Esther realizes she's in a precarious position here. On one hand, she's mourning the potential loss of not only her kindred, but also herself, because it will be made aware that she too is a Jew, and she falls under this law of the Medes and the Persians, which is irrevocable. And so Mordecai, in trying to stress that she needs to go into the presence of the king, puts her in a precarious position. Mordecai makes a statement that is quite interesting. Down in verse 14 of chapter 4, he says, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this." So what we find taking place is Esther realizes that she is in a dangerous situation, and yet at the same time, Mordecai tells her, "Esther, perhaps the reason you have come to this royal position is for this moment in time." Now, what will Esther do? She has her own free will, and in this defining moment, will she exercise it on behalf of her people? Well, listen to the way she responds. Verse 15 says, "Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, 'Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, and even though it is against the law, if I perish, I perish.'" Of course, that's a famous line out of the book of Esther. If I perish, I perish. I leave this in God's hands. Now, one of the things that we tend to overlook in this chapter, besides the two famous phrases, "You were born for such a time as this," and "If I perish, I perish," is this idea of a 3-day fast. And that's what I want to concentrate on for the next few moments. I've entitled this message, "Fasting for a Future." Fasting for a future. What Esther does is call for a national fast. And these are days whereby they restrict the intake of food and drink night and day. Now, the Bible talks a lot about fasting, Old Testament and even some in the New Testament as well. Some Christians observe fasting on a regular basis, others do not. I don't think that's the point of this chapter. The point of this chapter, it seems, is this national fast that she is calling for is not just a time for her to contemplate and to pray about whether she should go in and talk to the king. In many ways, it's a national rallying cry. It's a way that the whole nation can be united behind Esther so that God can intervene and bring about deliverance. While Esther's fast in the story is certainly an inspiring turning point in the narrative, there's something more that is going on here for those of us that can look back on the text in light of Jesus. She calls for not a 7-day fast, not a 30-day fast, not a 1-day fast, but a 3-day fast. The number 3 is important all through the Scriptures. It seems as though God does His best work at the end of the 3rd day. And what we find taking place here is this is something more than simply abstinence from food. Esther would not have known this, but the significant and symbolic element of this fast is on the 3rd day, it's the day of resurrection. It's the day of power. It's the day of God's intervention. And so maybe Esther, if she had lived a little bit longer, I mean much longer, would have understood what Paul was saying in the book of Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul looks at his own day and the emperor and the called Caesar in his day and the empires as well. And what we find is he makes this statement as he closes the letter to the Ephesians in chapter 6, verses 10 through 13. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore put on the whole armor of God, so when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. Stand firm, he says. Stand firm. It seems as though we often overlook that in the world in which we live, the racism, the hatred, the inequities, the injustices are not just committed by men, but they are empowered by forces beyond man. And what we find is a spiritual battle that goes on as well. And in this spiritual warfare, the Apostle Paul is talking about these heavenly places, unseen to us, that tend to fuel the hearts of individuals that point criticism and hatred and condemnation upon other people. And this is what we see all through the Bible. We see it in the story of Esther. We see Paul referring to it in the book of Ephesians. The battle often determines the rise and falls of many people groups in the world in which we live. Esther lived in Persia along with many other Jews whose families had been taken captive in Judah 100 years prior. And when Mordecai brings this news of the plot to kill the Jews, she knew the stakes. She would risk her life in approaching the king, and the future hangs in the balance. And she calls for a national day of fasting so that there might be this spiritual movement that takes place so that those that are against the Jewish people, those that are positioning themselves with Haman at the lead, he's not going to kill all the Jews himself. It will have to be a whole system of people to carry out this decree. She calls upon this not only to raise awareness of it, but to call upon people to stand fast, and we'll see toward the end of the book, that's exactly what they do. So when we come to this particular chapter, and we talk about fasting, we're not really talking necessarily about the kind of fasting that some people do, because in all world religions, there are times of fasting that takes place. Think about it for a moment. In Islam, during the month of Ramadan, Muslims not only abstain from food and drink from dusk until dawn, but Their focus is on worship through extra prayers and supplications. In Hinduism, fasting not only relates to the attention of food and drink, but also as a means of purification and self-control. In Judaism, the practice of fasting is an important teaching in the Jewish faith because it's deeply rooted in the biblical text. Number one, it is symbolizing in many respects repentance over sins and the reestablishment of communion. We might say that fasting does on a regular basis what the Day of Atonement does for the Jews once a year. But it goes deeper than that. The book of Isaiah, chapter 58, verses 6 through 8, tell us that, "Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover him, and not only to hide yourself from your own flesh?" It seems as though Isaiah is saying there's a physical aspect to fasting, but there's a spiritual aspect as well. It is to help us become more aware of the inequities in the world in which we live. Within Buddhism, fasting is practiced in order to purify oneself from negative karma. And of course, within Christianity, we see Jesus himself goes into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan, and he fasts for a period of 40 days and 40 nights. We are about ready to enter into a period of time that is also 40 days. Within about a week and a half, on Ash Wednesday, we enter into the period of time known as Lent that leads up to Easter. And Lent is often called the Great Fast. And of course, you know people, and I know people, who will often give something up for Lent as a symbolic expression of wanting to get closer to God, to repent of sins, and to be sorrowful of the mistakes that we have made over the past year, but looking forward to the resurrection, that third day that I mentioned a moment ago. But also within this is this idea of almsgiving. All the world religions also in fasting has this emphasis on almsgiving that Isaiah mentions in chapter 58. Now, this fast also is in contrast to the feasts. Remember, we've already had 3 feasts in chapter 1. Here we have a fast in chapter 4, and what we're going to find is a couple more banquets or feasts are going to take place in the coming chapters. So there's a literary contrast that's taking place here as well. While all of the king's court is feasting rather, here we find Esther and the Jewish people fasting. So fasting is often used as a tool to make a political statement, to protest, or to bring awareness to something. A hunger strike is a method of nonviolent resistance in which participants fast as an actor in the political protest to provoke feelings of guilt or to achieve a goal or a policy change. That's what I think Esther is doing here in chapter 4. It doesn't work, though, because it's an irrevocable decree. And so they will have to fight and defend themselves later in the book. But she, at first, is trying to do a nonviolent expression of reversing this policy of King Ahasuerus. Now think about it. A spiritual fast incorporating a personal context of social injustice. We see it in the course of our own history as well. The political leader Gandhi undertook several long fasts as a political and social protest. Back in 1981 in Northern Ireland, if you're old enough to remember this, there was a man by the name of Bobby Sands that took part in the Irish hunger strike to protest for better rights. Cesar Chavez undertook a spiritual fast, including a 25-day fast in 1968 to promote the principles of nonviolence and the hope of making a better living for farmers. So we see it in our own context as well. So a fast, number one, creates solidarity, and that's what Esther is doing here. And it is also found within the Jewish text in the Old Testament that even when the nation has to go to battle to defend themselves, on the day of battle, the warriors fast. Now, isn't that kind of counterintuitive? You would think that they'd want to eat, to have their full strength to go to battle. But there's something more that takes place. The soldiers that often went out to war were simultaneously holding the spear in their hands, but turning their heart to God by fasting on that day of battle, because they recognize that sometimes it is only God that can secure the victory. And so as we close this message today, we see that Esther will prevail because she recognizes that she, number one, has been providentially placed into the position. Number two, she will make a perilous move to go into the presence of the king to intercede on behalf of her people. And then number three, she calls for a national fast to bring solidarity and union, to turn to God and ask God to intercede in this way so that no blood would be shed. Now, in days of threatening circumstances, whether it's personal, you might enter a time of fasting. You might not choose it, but something so traumatic has happened in your life, you just can't eat. Have you ever been in that situation? It's almost as a fast has been thrust upon you because you've lost your appetite. But I would also say that fasting for a future is done communally as well. I mentioned earlier in the service that we have not been together for months and months and months. And in a way, we are fasting for a future. What I mean by that, it doesn't relate necessarily to food and drink, but it does relate to the fact that we have chosen to stay away for the betterment of other people so that they might not get sick, that they might not contract COVID, that they might not be placed in the hospital or potentially die. So we're taking that very seriously. I know some people are not. And I know that it's been hard. It's been hard not seeing each other. It's been hard not hugging each other. It's been hard communicating with each other. But I'm telling you something, over the last number of months, even though we've only been able to meet online, we have been fasting from community for the future of a better world in terms of health, in terms of not giving each other the type of disease that could potentially bring harmful effects. And so fasting is this way of thinking about coming together for the sake of a better future. It can be done with food and drink, but many times it's more than that. It's this symbolic representation that together we are calling upon God to intervene in a situation. That's what Esther did. At times, that's what we must do as well. So we close this message, fasting for a future, with you turning to God and just asking God, have I been placed where I am for such a time as this? And should I make the dangerous move at times to help intervene on behalf of other people who cannot take care of themselves? That's what Mordecai asked Esther to do on behalf of the Jewish people. We'll pick up the story next week, and we'll see where it continues. Thank you.